Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox Recording here to show you how you could build your own custom tracking template within your DAW and why you should do it. Now, when you're in the studio recording bands, the more efficient you are, the better, even if you're recording your own band within your own home studio. When it comes time to track drums, guitars, vocals, you don't want to have to be setting up tracks from scratch, loading up plugins and doing everything from the beginning every single time. When you think about it, that really doesn't make much sense. In my opinion, the way to go about it is to make a basic template, a basic tracking template that you could pull from every time you get to work on a new project within your studio. So what I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna walk you through my template, show you all of the inner workings and routing, and maybe you can learn something from it and implement it within your own studio. Okay, so here we are at my computer. I have Pro Tools loaded up, which is my DAW of choice. And by the way, everything we are going to cover in this video is applicable to any DAW on the market. It does not matter what you're using. The concepts are universal. So let's say right now I have a band in the studio, I have my DAW loaded up, and it's time to get started on a new track. What do? Well, I'm gonna show you. So what I'm gonna do right now is start a new blank project. I'm gonna just call this, I don't know, song 1. Got my sample rate set to 44.1, which I always use, and my bit depth is 24-bit. Okay, so I'm in my DAW and I have a completely blank session, no tracks loaded, nothing, completely blank. Now what I see a lot of people do, and I used to do this in the past, is they would just start making blank tracks like this. Let's say they were recording drums, they'll just make 10 blank tracks. Okay, then you gotta go and you gotta name all the tracks. And if you don't want your drums sounding like crap, then you gotta load plugins on your tracks. Those are a lot of steps to take when a band is sitting there waiting. So what I like to do is I like to make my life way easier, and I like to bypass all of this by pulling from my template. So let's do that. Okay, right here is my template, Frightbox Studio template. I'm gonna highlight all of my tracks. And right here is my entire tracking template. Now within my tracking template, I'm mainly using stock plugins. This is because I work with a couple other engineers in my studio and I want to be able to be compatible with them as well. And not all of us are using the exact same plugins. And by the way, shout out to Ben Karras and Brianna Testa. They're always doing killer work at a Frightbox Recording. And we all use the exact same tracking template, and it's extremely simple and saves a ton of time. So just to run you through this, if you look here, here are all of the drum tracks. Kick, snare, snare bottom, tom 1, tom 2, overhead left, overhead right, China, ride, hats, room left, and room right. Now, obviously, if we're recording a drum set that doesn't utilize as many drums, we will just delete the tracks before we start recording, but they're here if we need them. And the same goes for if we need a track that, let's say, isn't in the template, all we have to do is duplicate one of these tracks. So for example, there are only 2 tom tracks here. Let's say in this particular project, the drummer has 3 toms. All I'd have to do is duplicate this track, name it Tom 3, and it's ready to roll. I did not have to create a track from scratch, load up a plugin, dial in the settings, none of that. All I had to do is duplicate one of the tom tracks and create that 3rd tom track. It's as simple as that. Now, as far as processing goes, I like to keep it super simple, but still dialed in enough to where it's inspiring for the band. So in other words, working from a template has 2 primary benefits. 1, it saves a ton of time when we have a band in the studio. And number 2, the tracks end up sounding a little more like a record than just raw tracks. Now, as far as processing on the individual tracks, it's nothing fancy. Like if we look at my overheads, I'm just rolling off low end, cutting a little bit of harsh mid-range. Here's my bass guitar, have a stock amp sim, basic EQing, rolling off the low and top end, and a little bit of compression with a stock Pro Tools compressor. Same thing goes for guitars. We're just using the TSC Audio X50 and some basic EQ. Again, just rolling off a little bit of low end and a little bit of top end, just so the mix sounds decent while the band is tracking. Now, when the mix is played back, does it sound like a polished radio-ready mix? Of course not, but it sounds way better than just a bunch of raw tracks, believe me. Here we have some lead guitars, clean guitars, all using amp sims, and here's the reason why. When we record at the studio, we always track DIs. This is because if we decide to use a real amp later, we'll simply reamp the DIs through real tube amps. A lot of times at the studio, there are some overlapping projects happening, so it makes no sense to mic up amps live when you could just reamp it later and get the exact same results. Also, it keeps tracking way more simple, and we can focus on the performances instead of micing an amp every single time. Okay, and after that, we have some vocal tracks here. We have some basic compression with a stock Pro Tools compressor, some basic EQ rolling off some low end, a little bit of lower mids, and that's about it. Now, as far as routing goes, it's super simple. Each set of instruments has its own submix. So all of my drums, from kick to room right, is being routed to my drum submix. All of my guitars are being routed to the guitar submix. All my vocals are being routed to the vocal submix, so on and so forth. There's even a leads guitar submix here if we want to adjust the guitar leads on the fly. Again, it all comes down to efficiency. Instead of having to go and raise the volume of all of our drums, when a drummer wants to hear more of the drums, we can just raise the drums submix. And the same goes for the vocals or anything else. Now, there's not a bass submix because bass is really only one track, and there's no reason to make things more complicated than it needs to be. And as you can see, we already have a click track set up and ready to roll in our session. So if I play this back, all we have to do is go and pencil in the proper tempo of the song, and we're ready to record drums. Now, the other thing I want to point out is I do have some send effects set up just so there's some vibe and character that we could pull up while tracking the bands. So let's say a guitar player is recording a guitar solo. It's nice to have that delay ready to roll just to keep them inspired while they're tracking their guitar parts. And the same thing goes for reverb. A lot of times singers want to hear a little bit of reverb in their headphones, and it's good to have that ready to roll instead of having to, again, set all of that up from scratch when you can have it in your template. And again, keeping things as simple as possible, all of the instruments are sharing the same send effects. So in other words, my drums are using the exact same reverb that my vocals are using or anything else. And I found that the only two send effects that you really need while tracking are delay and reverb. And as you can see, they are already set up in my session, ready to roll. And again, I just want to reiterate this point that I'm using mainly stock plugins so I can be compatible with anyone that works in my studio. Nowadays, people buy new plugins every 5 seconds, so it's very difficult to stay compatible with someone when you may or may not have the same plugins that they're using. So by using stock plugins, as long as we're using the same DAW, we could pretty much run the exact same sessions. Really, the only exception in this session is the TSC Audio X50 plugin, which I make sure everyone has when they start working at the studio. So this right here is just a blank session with no files loaded in, just waiting to have a project recorded straight into it. So what I'm gonna do right now is give you a real world example of what this template sounds like in reality. So here's that same tracking template, but with some actual files loaded in. And let's hear how it sounds. Okay, so as you can hear, not half bad. Not a polished final production, but pretty decent from when you're sitting in the studio tracking. And all of this is done with just stock plugins with basic presets preloaded on the tracks. So let's quickly listen to these guitars. Yes, the guitars are just a TSC Audio X50 plugin, but in reality, what's recorded is this. So we always track DIs at the studio while we're recording, and we reamp them later if we see fit. Now, more often than not, the AmSim is more than usable. The truth is, you could achieve top-notch results from AmSims if you have a decent impulse response. And you can download this exact impulse response for absolutely free. There's a link below in this video's description. It's an IR of my favorite Mesa Boogie cab with V30 speakers out of the studio. So in other words, whenever I reamp guitars in the studio through that cab, I'm just doing it for fun, because to be honest with you, this impulse response literally sounds exactly like the real thing. And with the sample I just played back, any effects you heard are just these two simple send effects. Now, when I recorded this track in the studio, I didn't have to start from scratch. All I had to do was import these tracks from my template and we were ready to go. Remember, when you're working within your studio, especially if you're doing this as a career, it's important to be efficient. Think your process through and save time. So I'm curious to know, do you use templates? Do you use a tracking template when you record in the studio? Leave a comment in the comment section below and let me know your opinion. I'd love to hear it. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. You can both like and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the description below. And again, you could download the exact same impulse response that I'm using in this template for absolutely free. There is a link below in this video's description. Download it, load it into your AmSim plugin, and get right to dialing in killer metal guitar tone with absolute ease. Until next time, happy recording.